everyone, I'm Gretchen Worth, and we will get going tonight as we continue to admit people to the session tonight. So thanks for joining us for the Christopherson Center Book Club Speaker Series on the Frontline of Change, Positive Acts and Planning. I'm the project director of the Susan Christopherson Center for Community Planning, which is the organizer of the series. The Christopherson Center works across New York State to support communities in planning for a more equitable, climate-resilient built environment. And we've introduced this series as a way to offer conversation around New York State planning challenges and opportunities. We're very excited about tonight's program, which takes as its jumping off point a book published 6 years ago, Native American Land Rights in Upstate New York by Cindy Amrhein, who we're really fortunate to have with us tonight. So before we start, a couple of housekeeping details. Please keep yourselves muted throughout the event so that everyone can hear the conversation. We are recording the event tonight, and we'll share that out to everyone who's registered in the next week or two. So you will receive an email with a link to that. Next slide, please. So thanks to American Planning Association Upstate New York chapter, we are offering CM credits to AICP members for the event this evening. If you'd like to receive credit, please email info@christophersonCenter.org, which you can see down at the bottom of the slide, with your name and affiliation, and put in the subject line, February 7th, CM credit. Next slide. Our next book, Paved Paradise, How Parking Explains the World by Henry Grabar, is scheduled for April 3rd, followed on June 5th by Arbitrary Lines, How Zoning Broke the American City and What We Can Do to Fix It. So you can register for both these virtual events on the Christopherson Center website, christophersonCenter.org. For our conversation tonight, we'll keep this event to an hour, and we'll hear first from our speakers about how they came individually to their interest in and work involving Native American land rights. That will be followed by a presentation by Cindy, and then an informal conversation about history's impact on planning considerations today. We hope you'll participate over the next hour by putting your questions and comments in the chat, and we will try to incorporate those, as many as we can, as we go along throughout the evening. So I know that we are joined tonight by people from across and beyond New York State. I'm based in Ithaca, and so I would like to acknowledge that Ithaca is on the traditional homelands of the Guy Kahono, the Cayuga Nation. The Guy Kahono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Ithaca, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Guy Kahono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Guy Kahono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Next slide. So I'm really delighted tonight for our 2 panelists and moderator. First is Cindy Amrhein. Cindy is the author of our book, and she is currently the county historian for Wyoming County, New York. After working for 10 years as a freelance abstractor for a title search company, Cindy changed her focus to title searching only historic properties in Native American land. From 2004 to 2006, she was a weekly columnist for a Native American newspaper in northern New York State, the Akwesasne Phoenix Sundays, now out of print, under the pen name of History Sleuth, a handle she still uses online. Her book, A History of Native American Land Rights in Upstate New York, is on its way to becoming a reference for land claims. It is now carried by over 100 colleges and university libraries in 33 states, including Columbia University, Princeton, Harvard, Oklahoma State, Texas A&M, and Yale University Law School Library, as well as 9 other countries. She's also done historic research for law firms concerning class action lawsuits for silicosis and asbestos claims, and background information for film companies. When she's not doing land research, she can be found writing historical true crime or plotting out murder mysteries. Upon retirement from the county at the end of this year, she plans on returning to being an independent researcher. Welcome, Cindy.
Thank you.
Sue Ellen Herne, Bear Clan from Akwesasne, is an artist with over 40 years experience in creating thought-provoking paintings and installations with a focus on Haudenosaunee, specifically Mohawk, culture and language. Images of her work can be found in Iroquois Arts, a directory of a people and their work, 3 Centuries of Woodlands Indian Art, and Iroquois Art, Power, and History. Sue Ellen is a lifelong learner of culture and language and has shared what she has learned in classrooms, through her art, and in her 23-year tenure as museum program coordinator at the Akwesasne Museum. In 2018, she left the museum to enroll in a full-time Mohawk language program sponsored by the St. Regis Mohawk tribe. She continues to study and has skills to teach the basics. She has been a Mohawk educational assistant for the Akwesasne Mohawk Board of Education and is currently studying in a program sponsored by the Language and Cultural Center in Kanawake. She continues to make art in a variety of media. Sue, thanks so much for being here tonight.
Yeah.
Our moderator, George Frantz, is an advisory board member of the Christopherson Center with more than 35 years of experience in land use planning and urban design, both in the US and internationally. George has 2 decades of experience working with communities throughout upstate New York and Pennsylvania. He is currently an associate professor of the practice in the Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University, where he teaches in the area of land use and environmental planning, cultural landscapes, and open space protection. He has a bachelor degree in landscape architecture and a master of regional planning degree, both from Cornell University. His first engagement with Native American land issues in New York was the Cayuga Nation's land claim in Seneca and Cayuga counties in the 1970s and 1980s. More recently, his Cornell planning field workshops have placed students in the Seneca Nation of Indians to complete planning projects while also learning about land, sovereignty, and identity. So thank you so much, the 3 of you, for being with us tonight. I want to turn it over to you to speak a little bit more personally about your involvement with this very fraught, complex subject of Native American land rights and its impact on community and planning decisions today. So Cindy, maybe we can start with you and just how you came to write this book, published in 2016.
It basically started with me when I became the historian for the town of Alabama in Genesee County, which was like 1997. And I had thought nobody had recorded anything about the Tonawanda Senecas who were right next door to us. So as I got more interested in that, the Grand Island land claim came up. And if you could advance the slide one, could you advance? Yeah. If you look at Lake Ontario and Lake Erie there, you'll see that Grand Island isn't on the map. And you can also see distinctly that the Iroquois nations are there distinctly on these early exploration maps. So I thought, wait a minute, how could New York have bought Grand Island from the Seneca Indians in 1810 when did they really even know it was there yet? And mostly they didn't even survey the border between the United States and Canada until 1817. So that kind of is what got me interested in all of this. And somehow some people down in Cattaraugus Reservation heard about me and just the way I was speaking about stuff in just regular groups, and contacted me and said, you should write for the Akwesasne Phoenix Sundays. It's a Native American newspaper about the stuff you're finding out. So I started to do that. And then I was invited down to Cattaraugus to talk to a group of traditionalists there who were trying to learn more basically about the stuff they were denied knowledge of. So that's kind of how I got into all this. So I've been doing it regularly over, a couple decades, almost 3.
And so Sue Ellen, so you and Cindy met while she was researching the book? Is that?
She was, I believe, almost finished, but she was still, when I met her, looking for photographs and doing some finishing touches to the book. And so we met just briefly, and we met at the museum and talked about various things about our history. And my former coworker, the late Laura McDonald, I believe, was helping to search for photos, and I was helping a little bit too. And even ended up putting a photo of my grandfather in the book.
Sue was so helpful. I tried to approach who I was asking photographs for and reassure them that they were for the book, and I wasn't going to use any of their images to make stupid Facebook posts, you know, and be disrespectful in any way. And she was so helpful and welcoming. I really appreciated it. So do you want me to continue on, or?
Let's just have George talk for a moment about his
Okay.
his experience starting in the 70s and 80s, and then Cindy, I think we can pass it back over to you. George, you need to unmute.
Yes, of course, I would be the one member of the cast that does not unmute. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. And also welcome Cindy and Sue Ellen. It's good to see you guys again. Yeah, as Gretchen noted, I sort of cut my teeth as an activist back in the 1980s on the Cayuga land claim issue, and learned a whole lot about the level of emotion that can surround such an issue, misinformation, people just not understanding what was happening. And of course, it can be very acrimonious. Since then, of course, I am now a land use planner here in upstate New York, and I've worked again throughout the region. But, you know, the Cayuga Nation has a settlement that has enormous planning implications. It's actually my longtime mentor, Professor Robert Venables, who is an expert in Native American land claims in New York. I always remember a statement he made, and which is sort of the source of our challenges today. But back in the 1890s, the superintendent of the U.S. Bureau of the Census confidently predicted that the American Indian would be extinct within 100 years. They're still here. And in the case of the Cayuga Nation, they now have a settlement which permits them to acquire up to 10,000 acres of land in northern Cayuga County and northern Seneca County. And this has enormous planning implications for the region. The land acquired by the Cayuga Nation will again become sovereign land. It will be removed from the local tax bases. It will, because as a government, they are exempt from local taxes. They are also exempt from any sort of local planning and zoning regulations that are in force in the region. So that is actually a major planning challenge that I see facing the region in the coming decades. The same thing happened, and it continues to happen actually in the Allegheny territory of the Seneca Nation. Again, when the superintendent of the Census Bureau was proclaiming that Native Americans would be gone within 100 years, that actually coincidentally was around the same time that the US government forced a new 99-year lease between the Seneca Nation and Salamanca on the Senecas. But again, hey, 99 years, 100 years, they're going to be gone. Alas, when 1991 came around, it was a very, very rude surprise for Salamanca and the many residents who lived there, because there would be a new lease negotiated. There was a tremendous amount of acrimony over the negotiations, but today there is a new lease, and I would say a much more just and equitable lease between the Seneca Nation of Indians and Salamanca. So these are just two reasons why I think the conversation tonight is important, because we really, myself, many other non-native residents, I may know more than most, but it's a very complex issue, and we need to really learn more about the whole issue of land and sovereignty here in upstate New York. So welcome.
Cindy, would you like to dive back into your slides?
Sure.
Okay.
So if we could go to the next one. So this is another example of a map a little later again, and you could see on the map it distinctly says the country of the 5 nations. So I don't think there was any illusion. I know a lot of verbal comment is always that well, they treated them as nations, and you know, this is like proof that they did, because they're calling it a country. And you could see 1747 Grand Island still isn't on the map there. If you can go to the next one. This is another one that coincides with the 1768 Fort Stanwix Treaty. And the red line was supposed to be the line that we swore we wouldn't cross. But, you know, of course we did. And again, 1768 on the other map, Grand Island is not there. So go to the next map, please.
Yeah.
So as you can see here, it says country of the Mohawk, country of the Oneida, country. You could, it distinctly says that. And a lot of things that we do wrong in our children's history book is we give them, you know, we show them a map of New York as if it looked like New York back in the day, when it was really only, you know, the eastern part of the state, and then a piece of, you know, New York goes to Vermont. And so I think that's a little erroneous, that we should show a map more like this in our children's history books when we're teaching them the history of New York. Now we see Grand Island though, so they figured out it was there. And I kind of understand how that could happen, because I know when I have company come in from out of town and we're driving along Robert Moses Parkway, they go, oh, that's Canada. And I'll be like, nope, that's Grand Island. So I can understand how in the beginning, I mean, the Seneca knew it was an island, obviously, because they hunted there. But I think the settlers were a bit confused about it on both sides of the border, not realizing it wasn't the other country. So if you could go to the next slide. So there's a website called davidrumsey.com. And if you're going to do any kind of research like this into land, you should really go to his website and look at the early exploration maps rather than searching maps of New York, because we're really not talking about New York. We're talking about a massive land that was primarily Indian country. Can you go to the next slide? So a lot of the treaties talk about preemptive rights, meaning, and we use that terminology differently today. We say buyer's first rights or options to buy. It sort of happens when, well, let's say Mr. Smith wants Mr. Jones's wants his land. Mr. Smith says, okay, we'll fill out this agreement, and when I decide to sell, if and when I choose to sell, I have to give you the first buyer's right. So that's basically what preemptive rights are. So when the Indians gave preemptive rights to these land companies, they weren't giving them the land. They were giving them first option to buy if they decided to sell. And it was always based on if and when they choose to sell. So if we look at this diagram here, and we'll pretend that that big green circle there is an Indian territory. If you could go to the next slide. Let's say they decide to sell a piece of it. And this is where the accepting and reserving clause comes in. And it is used today. A lot of times people are, especially with families, I find, if they're lazy or they can't afford a survey, and they have 10 acres and they want to sell 5, they'll give the deed description for the whole 10 acres and then say accepting and reserving the 5 acres that I'm keeping for myself. This was the same as how the reservations were made, and that's why they're called reservations, is because they were reserved out of a land negotiation. They were not included. So let's say here that the Indian nation in green decides to sell the land baron in blue there some land. So they sell him the gold circle. What has happened to the land in the middle? Has anything changed? Nothing has changed because it was accepted out. So when people say, oh, you live on, the so-and-so reservation in New York, that is incorrect, because these nations are not in New York. New York surrounds them. The United States surrounds them, because as the green circle shows us, absolutely nothing has changed. That is their same land, same dirt from time immemorial, as they say. And New York was like a big lesson for the United States, that negotiating, they didn't get what they wanted as quick as they wanted. So I think they kind of learned here what they didn't want to do. So when they went out west and took land from those nations, they would take it, then give it back and hold it in trust, or stipulate you can do this, that on your land. While here, green circle, in my example, nothing has changed. No title went back and forth. It's still theirs. And so, for example, the Macomb purchase in northern New York, accepted and reserved 6 miles square, 2 miles, 2 independent mile squares, and then the grassy meadows for the St. Regis. So that Macomb deed actually serves as a deed for the Macomb land and a deed for the St. Regis land. Okay, I know that was kind of long-winded. Can you go to the next slide? Also, another thing I find is tenants in common, which still goes on today. They use different terminology a little bit, but if you look in like early deeds of the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, if Albert Green and his wife Polly deed their land to Charles Smith and Sarah Smith, husband and wife, and Edward Jones and Carl Jones, their brothers. So now you have 4 people owning the land in common. And this is how a lot of the Indian nation lands are deeded in common, because they're a nation. So if they document the reservation that was held out. So for my example here, the treaty with the Mohawk in 1797, they had Joseph Brant and John Deserton. I never say his name right. I hope that's close. Signed the land away to New York on behalf of the Mohawk people. Now, and Corn Planter also signed it, and back in those days, and Corn Planter signed anything, it was like golden. He was the deal. So this is a kind of a ridiculous, way to do it, because just because Joseph Brant and John gave up the right to the land doesn't mean the rest of the nation did, because they held it in common. So these are the kind of things you find when you're researching land, things that wouldn't pass in a normal land transaction. They kind of do some sly things and skim around stuff. Can you go to the next slide? Now we're going to learn the difference between a square mile and a mile square. And when I wrote this book and I would send it to my editor and they would change everything to a square mile, I had to say, don't do that, and re-edit it and send it back. And I had to explain to them the difference because they kept switching my words when I really meant a mile square. So if you can go to the next slide. So when we look at a mile square, it describes shape. So it's a mile by a mile by a mile by a mile. So of course your inner interior is going to be a square mile. Can you go to the next one? But a square mile describes area. So any shape, even that green shape like that, or land that's meandering around a river, if you measure out the interior, it is possible that it equals a square mile. If you could go to the next slide. But if we say 3 square miles, that would mean the inner interior gives you 3 square miles. But now if you say 3 miles square, 3 by 3 by 3 by 3, then your inner area is 9 square miles. So I noticed that a lot in certain deeds, like for example, the St. Regis Reserve, the large piece, did not say 6 square miles. It said 6 miles square, and it's shaped like a rectangle. So I'm not, quite sure what that measures out to today, but it'd be interesting to see. Could you go to the next slide? So most of the land transactions I found, at least when it pertained to the Mohawk, the St. Regis up there, their deeds or their treaties with New York would start out as a treaty between New York and them. And the St. Regis were good at leasing land because they made money off of that. So they knew what they were doing. So it would start out as a treaty between so-and-so and the St. Regis Indians. And then at the end of the treaty, it would say, this deed signed this day. So they would change the document after it was signed in the signature section. So I put the treaties with the Mohawk St. Regis in the back of the book because they're kind of not very easy to find. You can find a lot of the federal treaties online, but these particular ones you couldn't find as easy. So I included them in the book. So the one land negotiation that looked beautiful on paper is actually the most egregious of all. So when, if you could stay on this one a minute, you can't see it very well, but to the left, all the way to the left, there's a block and it says land lease to Michael Hogan. There's a better survey of that coming up. If you could go to the next slide. When I took his deed description, which is very long, as you can see, and plotted out exactly what it said, because as I'm skimming it, I'm going, okay, across the river and under the river. What exactly does that mean? Because it sure looks like Michael Hogan's land is all on land and nothing about any water. So I plotted it all out. And can you go to the next slide? And what this deed had to do with is originally Michael Hogan had leased land from the St. Regis in order to run a ferry across the river, the St. Regis River. But what happened was he encroached and he just sort of kept spreading out a little further and a little further and a little further until he had a massive amount of land that ended up becoming Hogansburg. Now, when I plotted it all out, as you could see on the right there, and I followed it and had stumps in the water and, did the exact measurements with the CAD program, you could see all that his deed really was about was enough land to run the ferry across the river and back. So New York decided it was going to take charge of the ferries, like they have the Thruway Authority and such. So the paperwork, like I said, is beautiful. That Michael Hogan relinquished his lease rights over to the state of New York, and the state regis deeded over their rights to the state of New York. And so when they did the survey, they didn't read the deed description at all. What they did was they surveyed all the land that Michael Hogan had encroached. So that's how Hogansburg became to be Hogansburg. If you could go, is that the last slide? Might be. I think it is the last slide, isn't it? Yeah. So when we're reading these deeds and treaties and such, we have to be very careful that we even read the very boring parts. Because there's a lot of verbiage in there that paints a picture, especially in the really old deeds. They like microscopically tell you everything that happened to get this far, or if they met at a cafe and had an auction and sold something that way, they would spell that out in the deeds. And so although the paperwork for Hogansburg, as far as paperwork, was done the right way, no one read the deed description. So I think it was the 1940s, state regis brought a claim to the state of New York, and they were like, well, no, there's nothing wrong with this. Here's the paperwork, here's the lease. Michael Hogan signed it over, your people even signed it over. But nobody still read the deed description to map it out to figure out that it was really just supposed to be 144 acres of water, basically. So it's things like that I discover as I go.
I'd like to mention a few things. I didn't know if you're done yet, or just let me know when.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay. So, I think that my role in the conversation is to kind of help people to get an Indigenous perspective on this whole topic too. And so I wanted to refer to a couple of things so far. One is the idea of the maps. And what you have to remember is that we have a different culture, a different way of looking at land. And so native or indigenous maps are not the same as what a non-native map is. And we had a conference at one time when I was still working at the museum, and we had an author come in and he described it really well, because there actually is a very old map from a different nation, not Mohawk like what I am, but it's from a different nation. And I think it's on a hide, and there's circles where different villages are located, and the circles are the villages, but the land isn't anything that's delineated. The land is the land, and where people live is shown by the circles. And I also had a chance to see some baskets that were made by different nations out in the New England area. And their baskets would have patterns on them that actually had to do with showing villages and different things, in their surroundings. And what he mentioned was the British would put grid lines on their maps to show like where the edges of things were. It was regardless of mountains or rivers, it was just grid lines. And the French in general would follow rivers or natural parts of the terrain, but it was still like a line, like here's your side and here's my side. And so was really a clash of these different ideas of things when people from Britain and France came here and came onto our territories. We had totally different ways of looking at things. And there's cases, one especially with around the Mohawk Valley area, where Mohawk people had gone to Britain. They went to see the authorities in Britain, and they were trying to like negotiate and diplomacy with them, and they were horrified at the state of some of the refugees that were there. And so they actually set aside some land east, I think it's called East Palatine, in that area in the Mohawk Valley. And they said, those people are welcome to come to have a safe place. Like, they were really upset over seeing the way they were living. And so we had totally different perspectives on things. We were very democratic. We weren't always like that. It was part of our history when we got our democratic government. There's like a whole tradition that surrounds that that's too much to explain. But part of it is that each nation can do its own business when it only involves that nation. But we come together when it's something that's going to affect all of the nations, originally 5, now 6 nations in the Iroquois Confederacy, or the Haudenosaunee. And so those ideals kind of were adopted in part by the people who came from Europe when they developed the United States, those ideas of having a voice. But they also brought along with them their own ideas. And some of that was a different idea about land, like that you could purchase land, then it becomes yours, and you put a boundary between you and someone else. And those weren't our original ideas. And so that's some of the basic perspectives that have to be taken into consideration when you want to really look thoughtfully at this issue. Because the elective governments that were put into place on Native territories were cases of where the non-Native people wanted to be able to get what they wanted from the Native people. And so they would institute governments that they could interact with. And so that this is in that book, A History of 3 Counties. The author's last name is Hough, Hough.
Very good book.
I had heard this like just anecdotally, from like my family and stuff, but then I even read it, it's documented in there. He said the state actually instituted the St. Regis Mohawk trustee system that's called today St. Regis Mohawk Tribe. The state instituted it because they wanted to be able to have like 3 men who could sign a paper, and then they could get land from them. And so like, even though the paperwork might look great too, like, you're finding discrepancies with what it actually is saying, but like on paper, but technically that isn't even valid, because like you said, with Joseph Brent and John Deserano, like when they were signing things away, they weren't speaking on behalf of everyone. And so today there is a land claim that's in the process of being negotiated between the state and some Mohawk people, but it's not all Mohawk people at the table. So it's still really flawed. And so that's part of like where we're at today. And I know it does come into play also with the Cayugas, because there's different outlooks among the Cayuga too. And so sometimes it's like, who is at the table when decisions are made, and it doesn't always include everybody. And that's what I would hope can be worked towards. So those were the 2 things that I wanted to mention, kind of related to what had come up already.
Can I pipe in on sovereignty too? Yeah, it's what the majority of people in New York State do not understand natives is in 1784, the United States signed a peace treaty with the Haudenosaunee that recognized them as a nation. And those boundary lines of New York State from the 1780s were international boundaries accepted by the United States and the Haudenosaunee. Not so much New York State, but and that was reinforced in 1796 with the Treaty of Canandaigua. So this is why, you know, the lands of the Haudenosaunee in New York State do have special status that, as Cindy said, the United States learned a lot in negotiations with the Haudenosaunee. There were better ways to dispossess nations of lands.
Yeah, quicker, right.
Quicker, yeah.
Exactly.
But that's why when you drive into any of the Haudenosaunee territories, okay, we use the word reservation, but they are sovereign territories. And that's why you see those signs along I-81, the Southern Tier Expressway, etc. And speaking
I think
of,
that's the big view we have to change is
Yeah.
they are not in New York State. We are around them and they
Yes.
are totally separate countries.
and that point was driven home to me a couple years ago when we were in Salamanca making our presentations to the officials of the Seneca Nation. And of course, I-86 runs through the Allegheny Territory. Well, not according to the Senecas, because Congress unilaterally designated Route 17 Southern Tier Expressway I-86 in 1992. The Seneca Nation did not give any right-of-way to the United States of America. They gave a highway right-of-way to the state of New York for Route 17. So we had to go back and remove I-86 emblems from all of our maps because the Seneca do not recognize that, and they have the right as a sovereign nation not to recognize I-86. So it's interesting, but these are things that we can, I as a planner know, but most people do not.
There's a question in the chat that asks if perhaps you could speak to some modern day implications around this idea of land ownership, the situation today. So how is that? And George, you alluded to this earlier when you were speaking about some of the decisions communities are making now, perhaps misunderstanding or not understanding, you know, the sovereignty situation, planning, zoning, etc.
Yeah, well, again, because they are considered sovereign nations under the law, under treaties, they are exempt from many of the regulations that we are subject to. A big one, of course, is zoning. And that has implications in a number of places, particularly around Oneida, because again, the Oneida Nation has been acquiring land as well due to the land settlement in the 1980s. And so every time they take a piece of land or acquire a piece of land, it becomes part of the Oneida Nation and it's Oneida territory. And so it's no longer taxable and is no longer subject to local land use jurisdictions. So, and again, north of Nacuga Lake, the Nacuga Nation has already acquired about 1,000 acres of land. And they will be acquiring up to 10,000 acres of land. And that has, you know, in my opinion, tremendous implications for the 2 or 3 small rural towns that are going to be losing land and revenue.
Sue, do you know anything yet how that Hogansburg, that was another recent land claim, and now it's just Mohawk living on Hogansburg. So do you think the state's gonna like give it back?
Well, it seems likely, but it's, as a Mohawk person, it seems really hypocritical that like the state is like only really willing and eager to include parts that are already owned by Mohawks. But there are negotiations going on to increase the land base here as well. I don't know the details of it because it is in negotiation.
Mhm.
And again, what makes it difficult is we have more than one government here. And
Right.
traditional government is not only a government for here, it also is recognized like through Onondaga as being the nation government. And so part of the reality of today's world is that Mohawks ourselves are having to figure out how to deal with this as well, because we don't have the same perspectives on things, and we also have also been educated in the non-native way of looking at the world, and so sometimes we ourselves are kind of at odds with how to proceed when there's different things like this. But I know some of the things that have come up is that they are looking at these communities surrounding us, and their needs are being put into the whole negotiation process. So as a Mohawk person, I'm kind of offended that, you know, a land claim that's supposed to be kind of, in my mind, you know, restitution for these things that weren't done in the right way, that they're taking into consideration the surrounding communities to such an extent that they can actually stop negotiations at some point, you know, because they're not satisfied with something on the non-native, you know, in the non-native communities and county. But in some ways it ends up working out, because sometimes if you have to take things slower, you actually a better conversation going and you get better solutions. And to me, that is like our traditional way of looking at things, that people are supposed to take their time and look at how things are going to affect the next 7 generations. And so I think slowing things down, even though at first I was kind of offended, it was probably a good thing in the long run. It was, I believe Franklin County was the reason why it kind of stopped for a while, because they didn't like how things were progressing. But like I said, I'm not privy to all the details of everything. But I'm hoping that this conversation can be drawn out long enough to make it something that's actually going to be productive for everybody. And I think that's the perspective of our culture that is really important for everybody to take time to learn, ourselves included, because we weren't allowed to know a lot of these things. We weren't allowed our history and culture, even our language. Like there's the whole boarding school experience that a lot of the general public doesn't know about, where kids were taken out of their homes and put into institutions away from their family and community in order to indoctrinate them into the non-native religion and way of thinking. And so what was mentioned earlier about like the prediction that we'd be gone by 1990 shows that, you know, we really do have a lot of strength, and we're still, and rather than disappearing, we're trying to heal and trying to make things better. And we do think about our neighbors, like, you know, like I did mention being offended by that, but but we do think about our neighbors, and I know that whenever there's a land claim, some people still get kind of worried on their end. Native people are like, oh my God, what's gonna happen? What are they gonna do to us? You know, but
Right.
we generally aren't thinking that way. Like, you know, we are trying to make things better for everybody. I believe the St. Rita's Mohawk tribe is like one of the biggest employers in the North Country and employs a lot of people from surrounding communities and really helps drive that economy. And so that's been the case from the beginning. Like I gave a link to Gretchen to put in the chat. People who want to understand more of our history, there's Six Nations Polytechnic has series of things that you can watch. And one of the things that was on there was about how when people first came from Europe, they were really weakened. They were small numbers. They probably wouldn't have survived if they didn't have the help of Native people. And like it's still a case of people are trying to work together. So I rambled on there, and I noticed I ate up a lot of time. A little bit of time left.
That was informative, though.
Thank you. So I don't know if we wanted to go back to Cindy or George, or if people in the audience had questions or something.
I would like to say that FamilySearch.org, the website that's run by the Latter-day Saints, has the deeds and indexes of all the counties in New York online. So you can, if you ever want to do some deed research or look up the deeds that I mentioned in the back of the book, you could go right online and get them.
I see a note in the chat to mute, but I'm not finding how to mute for some reason.
Oh, lower left corner.
Yep, got it.
Any other questions for me? Or if you've read the book, did I not explain well enough? It's, you know, when you get such an enormous amount of information that I had collected over longer than 10 years and try to put it in a book, it's, you know, it's difficult to shrink it.
I agree. I mean, I stumble even, you know, I've been learning about Salamanca, which in itself is a huge task.
Oh, I bet.
To understand everything that happened in that particular city. And yeah, so it's a very complex, and of course, for many, a very emotional challenge.
I find I just started talking with a group of traditional people up in Tuscarora Reserve, because there are some things I want to figure out about their land that I'm like, how did that happen, kind of thing, which is what leads me on these quests. But there were like 3 deeds to their reservation because they were left out of that whole treaty thing, and they were like, hey, you know, what about us? And so one of the deeds, like I said, read all the minutia detail in it, because one of the deeds was signed by the Secretary of War, and it said right in there that, well, first let me say, there have been times where New York State Fish and Wildlife has harassed them for fishing out of season in New York, when it's like, you know, they're on their own territory fishing. In one of these deeds, and signed by the, you know, Secretary of War, it, after it describes the land, it says that they have the rights to all the hunting, all the fishing, all the mineral rights. So if there's any minerals under the ground or timber rights, that was all theirs. So And when I went to speak to their group up there, they were quite surprised at that, because I don't think anybody actually maybe couldn't find the deeds for one, or I think that's part of it, is where do you look for these things if you're not, an abstractor? I'm used to coming up with all kinds of ways to search something by T for Tuscarora, N for New York, I for Indian, all the ways you got to go through these indexes, possibilities of how to find something. And when I was doing the St. Regis, I had to actually search in 3 different counties up there to get all the way back to 1787. So there's county hopping involved that, if you're not aware of county splits. So yeah, but when you find the deeds, sometimes they say interesting things like that. So I told them where to find it so they can like get a copy. And next time you're harassed about fishing, just say, this deed says the Secretary of War, you cannot harass me for fishing here. So, I mean, it's using New York and the United States old documents against them, I guess, to prove your side of the, your side of the argument. Sometimes you have to fight your enemy with their own weapons, in order to win.
Yeah.
Sometimes they don't want to hear the Non-Intercourse Act, blah, 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 because I've heard that before. Now give me something fresh and new. Okay, how about if I give you what all your documents say that we're entitled to? How's that? That's not us saying it, that's you saying it. You know what I mean? So that's why I thought the book was important.
Thanks. There's actually one of my favorite questions is in the chat. Yes, the Sullivan campaign, the Sullivan raid. The answer is 0, zilch, nada.
I can't see the question.
What effect did the Sullivan campaign terrorism have on land rights?
Land rights? Well,
Yeah.
they just swept through there and slaughtered everybody and burned all their crops. So,
and then ran away because it was the Seneca War Party.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, that was, that was that was Sullivan. And George Washington, once that was all settled and he became president, he really didn't want the interference of the states.
Yes.
He wanted to negotiate country to country. He really did. That was in a lot of his letters, and he would get really mad and he'd write a letter to Corn Planter, and he'd be saying, I took care of this whole Livingston 999-year lease for, who wanted to buy all of that before it got sold to Macomb. Ignore that. That got tossed out. And, anything is like, I really don't want the state. He would often have to write letters to like calm the nations down, because New York was like butting their nose in, trying to take stuff and not even have a representative of the federal government there, which was the law.
Yeah.
Or they would have, like, let's say you wanted to get a bank loan, right? You would have to go as yourself and sign the document in front of the notary, right? It wouldn't help if I went there and said, oh yeah, he told me he wanted to do this, and you can notarize my signature. That's what happened on some of these treaties. You have people making X's, or people saying, yeah, I saw him sign it, and notarizing the guy who said they saw him sign it rather than the men themselves.
Yeah.
So really read everything.
Yeah. But also, I mean, the Sullivan campaign is important to remember because in the 1930s, the Daughters of American Revolution, or New York State or whatever, had this campaign to put all these monuments up throughout the Finger Lakes, these granite monuments that gave people the impression that, yeah, Sullivan came, Sullivan conquered, and this is part of the USA, and how can you guys say we want it back? That was a key myth driving opposition to the Cayuga land claim. It's like, hey, we won this fair and square. And it's like, no, you did not.
Yeah.
So we're over time, but we have one more
Oh,
question,
sorry.
which no. I mean, as all of our previous conversations, we could talk for a very long time about all of this. But there's a question: how could George Washington give land grants to war veterans in Cayuga Territory?
Yeah, they shouldn't have done that. That was
New York State.
Yeah, that was New York. That wasn't the president. That was New York State. They kicked out the Brotherton Indians and all those there, and then used that. They did that with Seneca County too. They gave that to people who served in the war. I think that was 1812. But they granted, land after kicking the nations out, would grant soldiers because they were broke. They had no money.
Yeah.
So they granted them land that they just stole, basically. And then there were like 2 or 3 towns within Seneca County that they granted to Native Americans who fought in the war, but they kept them all in that county. Like, we'll put all of them in this county and give them this land. It's very odd to research that part of it.
Oh, and one more question, and then I think we'll wrap it up. But what about the Holland Land Company?
I'm not sure what the question is. Holland Land Company. Well, first you had Phelps and Gorham, who pretty much bought everything from Sodus Bay west. Then the mortgage came around to pay, and they couldn't pay, so they gave everybody back, all the land back to Massachusetts. That's the other thing. New York and Massachusetts had that deal. New York could govern, Massachusetts owned the land. So they had a representative from Massachusetts had to be at treaties too. But Holland Land Company eventually got that whole, everything probably basically Genesee River over, accepting and reserving the reservations that they did. And Mary Jemison's is a unique case, the Gardeau, because that whole strip Robert Morris reserved for himself because he was part of the negotiations. And he went bankrupt funding the Revolutionary War. So they eventually sold that whole strip off, which puts the Mary Jemison land in a whole different kind of category. So where Letchworth Park is, and part of Mount Morris and part of Castile. But that's a story for another day.
So Cindy, before we wrap up, just to that effect, are you still giving talks about the book around New York State? And is there a place where people who are interested in coming to something could find out more information in the future?
I haven't done it in a while because, like I said, I'm retiring this year. So I'm trying to wrap up everything with my job so I can go back to more research. Like, there's pieces of the bottom of the Cattaraugus Reservation I want to research too and figure out, what happened there, and the Tuscarora. So, I mean, I still do it if people want me to do it. I bring the whole slide presentation and do it. It's just summer's probably going to be pretty jammed up this year. Me trying to get everything done I need to get done before I retire. But it is online. It is online on YouTube.
Okay.
Someone had recorded it at one of the talks they gave and put it on YouTube. I think if you type the title of the book in YouTube, it'll probably pop up.
We will find that link and we'll include that in the email that goes back out to everyone with the recording of tonight. So I know we're over time, and I just want to thank the 3 of you for all of your wisdom and knowledge tonight that you've shared with all of us, and the time and the planning of all of this, which we are so appreciative of. And thank you all so much for the participants in the audience. And please, email if you would like CM credits, info@christophersoncenter.org. So thanks everyone for a very interesting discussion. And please consider signing up, registering for our April and June book discussions as well. You can see that all on the Christopherson Center website. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you looking at this as an important topic.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.